The rain hit the pavement like gunfire, and Amarachi Chukwu stood outside Seoul National University Hospital with her hand pressed against a belly she could no longer hide, watching the black car she recognized from 3 years ago pull to a stop at the curb. Baek Do-hyun stepped out into the storm without an umbrella, his eyes finding her across the parking lot with a hunger that had nothing to do with the son of a Mafia empire he was supposed to be. 6 months ago he signed the papers that ended their marriage. Tonight, he was going to find out exactly what he threw away. If you've ever loved someone who realized too late what they had, you already know this story is going to wreck you. Stay until the end, because what this man is about to do for the woman carrying his child will remind you why some love stories refuse to stay buried. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Hit that subscribe button before you get lost in this one, and let's begin. 3 years earlier, Amarachi had walked into a charity auction in Gangnam wearing a borrowed dress and carrying a stack of translation documents for a Nigerian textile company trying to break into the Korean market. She was not supposed to be noticed. She was supposed to hand her employer's proposal to the right investor, smile politely, and disappear back into the crowd before anyone asked too many questions about the woman with the West African accent standing where she didn't belong. That plan fell apart the moment Baek Do-hyun crossed an entire ballroom just to ask her name. He was the heir to one of Korea's most feared syndicates, a man whose family controlled shipping routes, real estate, and things polite society didn't discuss out loud. He was also, that night, a man who could not stop staring at a woman who laughed with her whole body at something his cousin said, completely unaware that laughing too loudly in that room was its own kind of rebellion. Do-hyun did not do things by accident. He found her name within the hour. He found her number within the week. 6 months later, he found himself standing in front of his father asking permission to marry her, which was the first and only time in his adult life he had asked permission for anything. The wedding was small, private, and beautiful. Amarachi's mother flew in from Lagos and cried through the entire ceremony. Do-hyun's mother, Madam Baek Do-hyun, did not cry. She stood at the edge of the reception in silk the color of dried blood and watched her son marry a Nigerian woman with an expression that could have frozen the Han River solid. The first year was not terrible. It was worse than terrible, because it was almost good. Do-hyun was attentive when he remembered to be, affectionate in the careful, guarded way of a man who had grown up being told that softness was a weakness his enemies would exploit. Amarachi told herself she could work with careful. She told herself patience was a kind of love, too. What she did not know, what she could not have known, was that his mother had spent that entire first year building a case against her. Quietly, patiently, the way a spider builds a web nobody notices until they're already caught in it. The catalyst came at the Baek family's two-seat gathering, 8 months into the marriage. Amarachi had spent 3 days preparing, learning the ancestral rites, practicing the vows, trying so hard to belong to a family that had never once made her feel like she did. Madam Do-hyun waited until the dining hall was full, until every cousin and uncle and family friend was seated with a clear line of sight, before she turned to Amarachi and asked, in front of everyone, whether it was true that in Nigeria women married for money because their own countries had none to offer. The room went silent the way rooms go silent right before something breaks. Do-hyun stood so fast his chair scraped against the floor loud enough to make the children flinch. His voice, when it came, was colder than his mother had ever heard it. Amarachi did not wait for him to finish defending her. She stood, thanked the family for the meal, and walked out into the November cold without her coat, because pride, it turned out, kept you warmer than fabric ever could. That night in the car, Do-hyun promised her it would never happen again. He promised he would speak to his mother. He promised 100 things a man promises when he is more afraid of losing someone than he is willing to admit out loud. Amarachi believed him, because believing him was easier than admitting the truth that had already started forming in the back of her mind, that his mother's approval mattered to him in ways his wife's happiness apparently did not. The following spring, everything shattered for good. Do-hyun's company was in the middle of a hostile territory dispute with a rival organization run by a man named Jang Suk-won, a dispute that had already cost 2 of Do-hyun's men their lives. His head of security came to him with intelligence that Jang's people had started asking questions about his personal life, about weaknesses, about the woman who wasn't born into this world and therefore didn't understand its rules. His mother used that intelligence like a weapon. She sat her son down and told him, with the calm certainty of a woman who had never once been wrong in her own mind, that the only way to keep Amarachi safe was to cut her loose publicly, cleanly, before Jang's people decided a foreign wife was the perfect pressure point. Do-hyun signed the divorce papers 3 days later without calling her first. Amarachi found out from a courier, not a conversation. She read the words dissolution of marriage in a language that had never quite felt like home, standing in the kitchen of the apartment they'd shared, and something in her chest went very quiet, the way the ocean goes quiet right before a wave you don't see coming. She did not call him. She did not scream, or beg, or ask why. She packed 2 suitcases, left her wedding ring on the kitchen counter next to a folded note that said only I hope her approval was worth it, and disappeared into a small apartment in Hongdae that nobody in the Baek family knew existed. What Do-hyun did not know, what nobody but Amarachi and her doctor knew, was that she was already 6 weeks pregnant the day she left. For readers who've made it this far, you already understand this story is about to test every wall this man built around his heart. If you want to see what happens when a Mafia heir realizes he threw away the one thing his empire couldn't buy him back, stay close, because the next part changes everything. 6 months passed in a blur of morning sickness, cheap noodle dinners, and a stubborn refusal to ask anyone for help. Amarachi found work translating documents remotely for the same textile company that had first brought her to Korea, enough to keep the lights on and the small apartment paid for. She told herself every single day that she was fine. She told herself the ache in her chest when she thought of Do-hyun's hands, of the way he used to trace slow circles on her shoulder when he thought she was asleep, was just hormones. She was, by every definition she had access to, lying to herself with impressive consistency. Her best friend Ngozi, who had moved to Korea 2 years before her and never quite left, was the only person who knew the truth. Ngozi showed up every Sunday with soup and unsolicited opinions, and it was Ngozi who eventually convinced her that hiding forever was not a plan, it was a slow surrender. That is how, 7 months pregnant and unable to hide it under even the loosest coat anymore, Amarachi ended up walking into Do-hyun's office building on a Tuesday afternoon to hand-deliver the last of the paperwork his lawyer had been chasing her for weeks about a joint account neither of them had bothered to close. She told herself it was purely administrative. She told herself she would be in and out in 10 minutes. She did not account for the elevator doors opening directly onto the executive floor where Do-hyun happened to be standing, mid-conversation with his second-in-command, looking exactly the way she remembered him and nothing like the man who had let her walk away. His pen clattered from his hand before she'd even said a word. He was staring at her belly the way a man stares at a door he thought was locked forever suddenly swinging open. His voice, when it finally worked, came out raw. Whose child is that? Not a question really, more a wound trying to speak. Amarachi met his eyes and said the only thing that felt true enough to say. Does it matter? You already signed me away. The words hit him like a blade between the ribs, and for the first time in longer than his staff could remember, Baek Do-hyun looked like a man who had lost control of a room. She tried to leave. He would not let her. He followed her into the private elevator, ignored his assistant's frantic questions, and stood too close in a space too small for the amount of history between them. How far along? He asked. Quieter now. 7 months, she told him, watching the number land. Watching him do the same math she'd already done 100 times alone in a dark apartment. We have not been together in 7 months, he said slowly. I know how to count, Do-hyun, she answered, and something in the flatness of her voice hurt him more than anger would have. The elevator opened onto the parking garage before either of them could say anything else that mattered. Amarachi walked toward a taxi with her chin lifted, the exact posture she'd carried out of his mother's dining room 8 months earlier, and Do-hyun stood there in his $3,000 suit, feeling for the first time in his adult life completely, utterly powerless. That night, he called his head of security, a man named Choi Jae-hoon who had been with the family since Do-hyun was a boy, and asked him to find out everything, her address, her work, her routine, whether anyone had approached her. Jae-hoon reported back within 4 hours, and what he found made Do-hyun's blood run cold. Someone had been photographing her building for the last 2 weeks. Someone connected, according to Jae-hoon's sources, to Jang Suk-won. The very thing his mother had warned him about, The very danger he had convinced himself he was preventing by pushing Amarachi away had found her anyway, alone and unprotected and carrying his child, precisely because she had no one watching her back. The next morning, before the sun had fully cleared Seoul's skyline, Do-hyun was standing outside her apartment building in Hongdae, coat still damp from a night he hadn't slept through. Amarachi opened the door in an oversized sweater, hair wrapped for bed, and the sight of her, soft and unguarded and furious to see him, nearly brought him to his knees right there in the hallway. "You cannot be here," she said. "I have every reason to be here," he answered. "You made your choice 6 months ago, Do-hyun. I made a mistake 6 months ago." He stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to hold his gaze. "I am not here to argue about the past. I am here because you are in danger and you don't even know it." That single sentence did what none of his apologies could have. It made her let him in. He told her everything, sitting stiffly on the edge of her second-hand couch like a man visiting a world he no longer had the right to enter. He told her about Jang Suk-won's territory war, about the intelligence Jae-hoon had gathered, about the photographs of her building taken by people who had no business knowing where she lived unless someone had told them she still mattered to him. Amarachi listened with her hand resting on her belly, and when he finished, her voice was very quiet. "So this is why you came? Because I'm a liability again?" "No," he said, and for a man built on control, the crack in his voice was almost violent in its honesty. "I came because I have spent 6 months lying to myself about why I signed those papers, and I am done lying. I told myself it was protection. It was cowardice. I let my mother convince me that loving you was a weakness I could not afford, and I have hated myself every single day since for believing her." Amarachi did not cry. She had promised herself months ago that she was done crying over this man. But something in her chest, something that had been clenched tight since the day she read that courier's letter, loosened just slightly. They agreed, that morning, on exactly one thing. She would let his security team monitor the building. She would not, under any circumstances, move back into his life as though nothing had happened. "If you think this changes anything else," she told him at the door, "you are mistaken." He nodded, accepted it, and left 2 of his most trusted men stationed outside her building anyway, because some promises, apparently, mattered more to him than the ones he made out loud. A few days later, everything accelerated in a way neither of them was prepared for. Amarachi was walking home from a prenatal appointment when a black sedan slowed beside her on a quiet side street. 2 men inside watching her with the kind of attention that made her stomach drop before her brain caught up to why. She did what any woman raised by a mother who survived Lagos traffic and worse would do. She walked faster, ducked into a crowded convenience store, and called the only number she trusted enough to dial in that moment. Do-hyun answered on the first ring. By the time he arrived 12 minutes later, breaking traffic laws his own security detail would later describe with something close to awe, the sedan was gone, but the fear in Amarachi's eyes was not something he could pretend not to see anymore. "Get in the car," he said, and this time, she did not argue. He took her to a property registered under a shell company, nothing connected to the Baek name, tucked into a quiet residential neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. It was not the penthouse she remembered, not a display of wealth designed to impress. It was simple, warm, stocked with actual furniture that looked used, and it had, she noticed with something between irritation and reluctant gratitude, ginger tea in the kitchen cabinet, the exact brand she used to drink when her stomach turned during their marriage. "You remembered," she said quietly, holding the box like it was evidence of something she wasn't ready to name. "I remember everything about you," he answered. "That has never been the problem." She stayed. She told herself it was only because of the danger, only because a pregnant woman living alone with a target on her back was not a position that allowed for pride. She chose her own bedroom at the far end of the hall. She set rules, real ones, about space and privacy and the fact that nothing about this arrangement meant she was coming back to him. He agreed to every single one without argument, which somehow made it harder to stay angry at him than if he had fought her on any of it. That evening was the first time in 8 months either of them had cooked a meal in the same kitchen. He tried to make her tea and steeped it for 3 minutes because the box said so. She told him he was wrong. He looked personally offended by this information and steeped it for 5 minutes instead, exactly as she instructed, with the same focused seriousness he probably brought to negotiating million-dollar shipping contracts. Watching Baek Do-hyun, feared heir to one of the country's most dangerous families, stand at a stove taking tea instructions from a pregnant woman he'd wronged, did something complicated to the anger she'd been carrying for 6 months. It didn't erase it, but it cracked it, just slightly, at the edges. "Why did you sign the papers so fast?" she asked him that night, the question she had been carrying since the courier handed her that envelope. He did not deflect. "Because you asked me to leave, and because it was easier to call it protection than to admit I did not know how to stay and love you the way you needed, out loud, in front of people who could hurt us both for it. That is the most honest thing you've said to me in 3 years, she told him. "I know," he said. "I don't know if I can be that honest every day. But I want to learn how." She did not forgive him that night. But she did not ask him to leave the house, either, and for 2 people who had spent 6 months in silence, that was its own kind of miracle. If this story has already grabbed something in you, imagine what's coming when Jang Suk-won decides Amarachi is worth more to him alive and desperate than dead. Stay with me, because the danger in this story is only getting started, and I promise you the way this man fights for his family is going to leave you speechless. Over the following 2 weeks, a careful, cautious rhythm formed between them. Do-hyun worked from the safe house more often than his office, something his assistant found deeply suspicious and never dared to question aloud. He drove her to appointments. He learned, slowly and clumsily, the difference between being present and merely being nearby, a distinction his own upbringing had never taught him. Amarachi watched him try, and though she guarded her heart with the same fierce discipline she'd guarded her pride with in his mother's dining room, something in her kept softening despite every instruction she gave herself not to. Then his mother found out. Madam Haesuk arrived at the safe house unannounced on a Thursday afternoon, dressed in the same cold silk elegance she'd worn to that Chuseok dinner, and the moment Amarachi opened the door, she understood exactly how this woman had built an empire of her own, quietly, without ever raising her voice. Madam Haesuk did not shout. She simply looked at Amarachi's belly, then at her son standing protectively behind her, and said, "So you have brought her back into your life, into danger, because of a child that will never truly belong in this family." Do-hyun's voice, when it came, was the coldest Amarachi had ever heard it, colder even than the night he'd told his mother off after Chuseok. "That child is my heir," he said. "And this woman is my wife in every way that has ever mattered. If you cannot accept both of them, then you no longer have a place in whatever life I build going forward." His mother left without another word, but the threat in her silence followed them into the house like a shadow that refused to lift. That night, unable to sleep, Amarachi found Do-hyun on the small back porch, whiskey untouched in his hand, staring at nothing. "I meant what I said to her," he told her without turning around. "I know," she answered, sitting beside him despite every instinct telling her to keep her distance. "But Do-hyun, your mother has resources. If she decides I am a threat to your position, she will not stop at words. Then I will make sure she understands that hurting you means losing me entirely," he said, and there was no performance in it, only the flat, dangerous certainty of a man who had finally decided which world he belonged to. 3 days later, the danger stopped being theoretical. Amarachi had gone, against Do-hyun's explicit instructions, to a prenatal yoga class 2 of his security men had cleared as safe that morning. Halfway through the session, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. A single photograph. Her building. Her car. The words underneath read, "Tell your husband to remember what happens to men who choose foreign wives over family loyalty." She called Do-hyun with shaking hands. He was there in 9 minutes. The following 24 hours moved like a fever dream. Do-hyun's security team traced the number to a burner phone purchased 3 blocks from Jang Suk-won's known territory, confirmation of exactly the threat his mother had once used to justify abandoning her. But there was a second piece of information buried in that trace, one that made Do-hyun go very still when Jae-hoon delivered it privately. The payment for that burner phone had come from an account with indirect ties to someone inside his own mother's household staff. His mother had not simply warned him about danger 8 months ago. She may have created the appearance of it, or worse, allowed a real threat to fester because it served her purposes, because a frightened son who believed his wife was in mortal danger was a son easy to manipulate into signing whatever papers were placed in front of him. Do-hyun confronted her that same evening, in the same estate dining room where she'd once humiliated his wife in front of the entire family. This time, there was no audience, only the two of them and a silence that stretched long enough to feel like its own kind of confession. His mother did not deny it outright. She simply said, with the terrifying calm of a woman who had never once doubted her own righteousness, that she had done what any mother would do to protect her son's legacy from a woman who would only ever complicate it. "You did not protect me," Do-hyun said, voice shaking with a fury Amarachi had never heard from him before. "You nearly got the woman I love and my unborn child killed because you could not accept that my life is not yours to design." He walked out without waiting for a response, and something in that walk, in the finality of his back turned to the woman who had raised him, told Amarachi that whatever relationship existed between mother and son had just changed forever. That night, back at the safe house, Amarachi found him standing at the window, the same posture she remembered from the earliest days of their marriage, when distance had felt like his default language. She did not approach carefully this time. She crossed the room and took his hand, and he let her, gripping it like it was the only steady thing left in a world that had just tilted violently under his feet. "I am sorry," he said. "For all of it. For not protecting you from her 3 years ago. For signing those papers. For every night you spent alone in that apartment carrying our child while I told myself I was being noble. I don't need you to be perfect," Amarachi told him quietly. "I need you to choose me, out loud, every single time it matters, even when it costs you something. Can you do that?" "Yes," he said, and for the first time since she'd walked into that hospital parking lot 7 months pregnant and furious, she believed him completely. Jang Suk-won, however, was not finished, and neither was Madam Hae-suk, whose pride had just been publicly wounded by her own son in a way she was not built to forgive quietly. If you have ever watched someone choose family over the person who raised them, you already know how much that choice costs. Stay close, because what happens next is going to test everything Do-hyun just promised, and I need you to see how far this man is willing to go to keep his word. 2 weeks later, 8.5 months pregnant, Amarachi had a routine checkup at the clinic Do-hyun's personal physician recommended. The same clinic security had cleared a dozen times over. What none of them accounted for was that Jang Suk-won's people had been watching that same clinic for days, waiting for exactly this kind of predictable, unguarded moment. She was walking to the car when 3 men approached from different directions, quick and coordinated in a way that told Do-hyun's security detail, arriving seconds too late, that this had been planned meticulously. Amarachi did not scream. She had learned, over months of living inside this dangerous new version of her life, that screaming rarely helped and often escalated. Instead she moved, fast for a woman 8 months pregnant, toward the clinic's side entrance, buying herself the 10 seconds that made the difference between capture and Do-hyun's men catching up. She made it inside. The men did not follow into a building full of witnesses. But the message had been sent loud and clear, and when Do-hyun arrived 11 minutes later to find his wife shaking but unharmed in a clinic hallway, something in him broke and reformed into something far more dangerous than grief. That night, he called a meeting in a room with no windows and men whose eyes had seen things that never made it into polite conversation. He stood at the head of the table and did not sit down once during the entire briefing. Jang Suk-won had crossed a line that had nothing to do with territory or shipping routes anymore. He had gone after a pregnant woman in broad daylight, and Do-hyun made it clear, in a voice so controlled it was more frightening than shouting would have been, that this would be answered decisively, immediately, and without mercy. By morning, Jang's known safe houses had been identified. By noon, 2 of his lieutenants had quietly disappeared into conversations they would not walk away from unchanged. By evening, Jang Suk-won himself was sitting across from Do-hyun in a neutral warehouse near the docks, the same kind of meeting that had once determined territory disputes over shipping routes now determining something far more personal. "You went after my wife," Do-hyun said, voice flat and lethal. "You went after my unborn child." Jang, older, scarred, a man who had built his own reputation on being unafraid of anyone, tried the same smile he'd used in negotiations for 20 years. "It was just a message," he said. "A reminder that men who choose foreigners over family alliances make themselves vulnerable." "Here is my message back," Do-hyun answered, Sliding a folder across the table that contained everything his people had gathered in the last 48 hours, financial records, offshore accounts, evidence of Jang's own betrayals within his organization. You have 24 hours to leave Korea permanently. If you or anyone connected to you comes within 100 meters of my family again, I will not stop at a warning. I will end everything you have built, and I will make sure everyone in this city knows exactly why. Jang stared at the folder, at the man across from him who had clearly stopped being the cautious, calculating heir everyone believed him to be, and understood, the way men in that world always eventually understood, that some threats were not worth testing twice. He left the country within the week. But the threat inside his own family, the one wearing his mother's face, was not so easily resolved with a folder of evidence and a deadline. Madame Hae-suk, humiliated by her son's public rejection and increasingly desperate to maintain her influence over an empire she had spent decades helping to build, made one final, catastrophic move. She reached out to Amarachi directly, not with threats this time, but with an offer, delivered through a lawyer, of a significant sum of money in exchange for Amarachi disappearing quietly before the child was born, taking the baby somewhere far from Korea, far from any claim to the Baek name or fortune. It was the same offer, dressed differently, that had haunted stories like Amarachi's own mother used to warn her about back home, the price some families were willing to pay to erase a woman they never intended to accept. Amarachi did not take the money. She did not even consider it. She took the offer straight to Do-hyun instead, watching his face as he read the terms his own mother had put in writing. "This ends now," he said, and there was no hesitation in his voice, no lingering loyalty pulling him back toward the woman who raised him. He called his father directly, a man who had stayed carefully neutral through most of this conflict, and laid out everything, the manipulation, the danger created and possibly orchestrated, the attempt to buy off his pregnant wife like a problem to be quietly removed. His father, to his credit, did not hesitate either. Madame Hae-suk was removed from all positions of influence within the family's holdings within the week, her access to company funds frozen, her role reduced to nothing more than a name on old paperwork. She did not accept this quietly. But without money, without influence, without the fear she had once wielded so effectively over her son, there was very little left for her to do except watch, from the outside, as the family she had tried so hard to control began building a life that did not require her approval. If you have ever had to choose between the family that raised you and the family you are building, you already know how heavy that choice is. This channel exists for people who understand exactly that kind of cost. If that is you, subscribe now, because what comes next is the moment this entire story has been building toward, and you do not want to miss it. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday evening that started ordinarily enough, Amarachi felt the first contraction while standing in the kitchen of the safe house, seasoning a pot of jollof rice that had been simmering since noon. She called Do-hyun's name once, quietly, and something in her voice made him drop the documents he was reviewing and cross the room before she'd even finished his name. The drive to the hospital was the fastest Seoul traffic had ever moved for him, every red light somehow clearing, every lane somehow opening, because a man with his resources and his fear moving through a city he controlled was not a man easily delayed. He held her hand through every contraction, breathing with her the way the prenatal classes had taught, whispering the same promise over and over, that she was safe, that they were both safe, that whatever came next they would face it exactly the way they had faced everything else, together. The labor was long, 11 hours of pain and fear and the particular kind of terror that comes from loving someone so completely you cannot imagine surviving anything happening to them. Do-hyun did not leave her side once. When the doctors finally placed their daughter in Amarachi's arms, small and furious and already announcing her presence to the entire delivery room, something in Baek Do-hyun's face transformed in a way none of his security detail waiting outside had ever witnessed. The coldness that had defined him for most of his adult life, the careful control his father's world had demanded of him since childhood, cracked open completely, and what was underneath was simply a man overwhelmed by love for two people he had almost lost through his own fear. They named her Adiz, meaning princess, a name Amarachi's mother had suggested over tearful video call from Lagos, and Do-hyun, who had never once in his life cried in front of another human being, held his daughter for the first time and wept without any attempt to hide it. The weeks that followed were not without difficulty. Building trust back after 6 months of separation and betrayal was not a process that finished the moment a baby was born. There were hard conversations, moments where old wounds surfaced without warning, nights where Amarachi found herself testing whether his devotion was real or simply the temporary intensity of new fatherhood. But every single time, Do-hyun showed up. He learned to change diapers with the same focused seriousness he brought to steeping tea correctly. He cancelled meetings that once would have taken priority over everything. He walked their daughter around the garden at 3 in the morning when she would not settle, murmuring to her in a mixture of Korean lullabies and the few Igbo phrases Amarachi had taught him, badly, but with an effort that meant more to her than perfection ever could have. 6 months after Adiz was born, on a quiet afternoon in the garden of a house they had chosen together, one that belonged to neither of their pasts but only to their future, Do-hyun got down on one knee in front of his wife and daughter and asked Amarachi to marry him again, properly this time, with vows they wrote themselves and a wedding that included every person who mattered without a single seat reserved for approval that was never truly theirs to give. "I promise to talk before I act," he said, voice thick with an emotion he no longer bothered hiding. "To choose you and our daughter over everything else, every single time, without hesitation, without needing anyone else's permission to love you the way you deserve." Amarachi, holding their daughter against her chest, looked at the man who had once let fear and family pressure convince him to sign her away, and saw instead the man who had burned down an empire's worth of danger to bring her home. "I promise to trust you even when trust is hard," she answered. "To remember that love that survives being broken is not weaker for it. It is stronger, because it chose to come back anyway." They married in a small ceremony months later, on a beach far from Seoul chandeliers and whispered judgments, just the people who had actually earned a place in their lives. Adiz, too small to understand any of it, slept through the entire ceremony in her grandmother's arms, Amarachi's mother having flown in and cried, predictably, from the moment she landed until well after the reception ended. Years later, when people asked Amarachi how she found the strength to walk back into the life of a man who had once let her go, she would tell them the truth. That love, the real kind, does not ask you to forget what someone did wrong. It asks you to watch closely enough to see whether they are willing to become someone new, and to trust yourself enough to know the difference between empty promises and a man tearing his own world apart to prove he meant every word. Baek Do-hyun never fully softened into someone unrecognizable. He remained, until the end of his days, a man capable of terrifying calm in dangerous rooms, a man other powerful people did not cross twice. But at home, in the quiet hours nobody outside their walls ever witnessed, he was simply a husband who steeped tea for exactly 5 minutes because his wife told him the box was wrong, and a father who never once, not for a single day of his daughter's life, made her wonder whether she truly belonged. Their story did not begin easily, and it was never going to end simply, because real love rarely does. It began with a divorce delivered by courier, and it became a marriage rebuilt with honesty, danger survived together, and a stubborn refusal on both their parts to let fear win a second time. Somewhere between a hospital parking lot in the rain and a beach wedding years later, two people who had every reason to walk away chose, instead, to stay, and to keep choosing each other every single day after that, because that, in the end, is what love actually requires. Not perfection. Not an absence of mistakes. Just the courage to come back, and the honesty to mean it when you do. If this story moved something in you, if you found yourself holding your breath through every danger and exhaling through every moment they chose each other anyway, let me know in the comments which part hit you hardest. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that broken things can be rebuilt into something stronger than they ever were before. And if you want more stories like this one, dark, dangerous, deeply romantic, and absolutely YouTube safe, hit that subscribe button right now, because we have so many more journeys like Amarachi and Do-hyun's waiting for you. Thank you for staying until the very end. This is where their story ends, but yours, whatever chapter you're in right now, is still being written.